Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's an absolute privilege to have Donald Robertson as my guest. Donald is the author of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. He's a cognitive-behavioural psychotherapist and the author of 6 books on philosophy and psychotherapy, including Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. And his graphic novel, Verissimus, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, is due for publication next fall, 2021, by St. Martin's Press. Again, welcome to the show, Donald. It's such a privilege to meet you today.
Well, hi, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to our chat today.
Well, thank you. And I want to start just with the framing of your book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. You begin with Marcus Aurelius on his deathbed, and then you end with Marcus Aurelius on his actually dying, with this wonderful poetic imagery where he's kind of looking through his life, and then he just passes. So how did you decide to set the book up that way, with kind of from deathbed to literal death, and then you have your own father's death at the beginning of the book? So how did that framing come about?
Well, first of all, I was asked to write a book about Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism, and I thought I need to kind of make it a little bit different, because I've already written some books on Stoicism. I wrote a book called Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. It's a general introduction to it. And so I thought I need to try and shake things up and make it a little bit different. And I thought telling the story of Marcus's life would be a good way to do that. And I've studied Marcus's life in great detail for a long time, particularly his education, because we learn a bit more about Stoicism from the various Stoic teachers that he had. But it struck me that wasn't the best place to begin the book, because the story of his education's not very dramatic. Basically, it's full of really interesting bits of trivia and stuff, but there's not a lot of action involved in young Marcus attending lectures on philosophy. So I thought, what would be a more dramatic way to open the book? I believe that books have to have a strong opening. And I thought, well, I'll start with him dying, and then we can go back retrospectively and go through his life. That works. And then we get to open much more dramatically with the Roman emperor dying. And I like paradoxes. So I thought it would be good to talk about a philosophy of life and begin by talking about the guy dying. And I also believe that death is really fundamental. The Stoics also seem to me, to put it crudely, to be characterized by this. One of the things that people like about Stoicism, the Stoics go straight for the jugular. So they tackle really quite challenging ideas. They're quite radical thinkers. And so I think it's very in keeping with that we start with death, which is one of their main themes. So, dropping the reader right in at the deep end. And then I started writing the book, and it all seemed to flow quite naturally from there. And I realized that this created a problem for me. And that is, how am I going to end the book? So the book kind of ends with the civil war, and then Commodus succeeds Marcus. But I also believe the book has to have quite a strong ending, and that's kind of an anticlimactic ending in a sense. So I thought it would be, cooler if he died at the end, but then we could do all this stuff about coming to terms with his own mortality. But I thought, I've already done that. And I think I remember saying to my editor, well, he can't die twice, unfortunately. And then I thought, but maybe he can. Maybe he can die twice. And I thought, well, the only way he could die twice is if we retell the story of his death from a completely different perspective. And I thought, well, we'll do it from a first-person perspective. So, because the first chapter is more about the events surrounding his death and how he interacted with other people and stuff. And then we could retell it from a much more subjective point of view, what it actually felt like inside. And my big passion for writing books like this is to take the philosophy and really try hard. It's hard work, but I love doing it. It's a labor of love to really connect the philosophy with actual events in his life. And now with his death, that's surprisingly easy. So the Meditations is written in an artfully vague style. Maybe I'll say more about that. But one of the characteristics of it is that he very seldom apart from book 1 or chapter 1, where he talks about a lot of people he knew, in the rest of the book, he speaks in an artfully vague, kind of abstract way. So, for instance, at the beginning of book 2, and probably the most famous passage, he says, every morning when you get up, tell yourself you're going to meet treacherous, deceitful, meddlesome people. He doesn't name any names, right? And so from a historian or a biographer's point of view, you think, well, I'd like to know who these people are that you're talking about, Marcus. Is it your wife? Is it your children? Is it your generals? Is it foreign kings? You know, is it senators? Like, I'd love to know who these people are that you're kind of having to brace yourself to meet. But he doesn't really tell us that. So one example that's really easy would be Marcus says loads of stuff about death, and then for sure he died. So it's reasonable to infer that as he was dying slowly from the plague, some of the same stuff was probably going through his mind. Like, it's reasonable to think he probably said the same things to himself that he said in the meditations. You know, we know what he believed about dying. We know how he was preparing himself to cope with it. So what happens if we imagine that he's actually doing that as he dies? And I think it intensifies it, and it makes it seem more real, more concrete. And so that was why I chose to write it that way. And then I thought, yeah, it almost seemed like too much to me, like overkill. And then I thought, no, I'll let the readers decide, you know, if I've gone too far and starting it and then closing it with death. But I think it really appealed. You know, people, they want an alternative to self-help that they find a bit superficial. And, you know, that by addressing these existential themes that, you know, I think people felt, okay, yeah, you know, it kind of goes for the jugular a little bit more.
Yeah, and just for the listeners, I finished up the actual meditation that Donald's talking about. The last chapter I was on Christmas Day here in the United States in 2020, and I found it just profoundly moving and just a great, powerful read. And the whole book is incredibly well written, which we're going to get into as we talk about. So the other thing that intrigued me right at the beginning. Again, you have the sad story that your father died when you were just a young man, actually a teenager, I think, right? And your mother gave you his wallet, and inside the wallet you find a slip of paper that has the famous passage from Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush, where God says to Moses, "I am that I am." And you mark that as trying to ponder what that all meant, and that was the beginning of your philosophical or even your spiritual journey for you. But then I was really intrigued that you encountered that text. Your father was a Freemason, which I know sort of what that is. I don't know a lot about that. In that you kind of got it via Freemasonry rather than maybe traditional Judaism or Christian roots. And so could you talk a little bit about some kind of key moments in your journey that kind of led you from that moment to becoming an expert in CBT, and also this interest that you have in philosophy? I know that's a big question, but that would be a really interesting to hear you talk about that.
Well, the first thing that happened, I guess, was when I read that. My father, you know, was poor and didn't really leave much, but he left a pipe rack with his favorite pipes on it, his wallet, and some books on Freemasonry, pretty much like all that he left behind. And so I remember like looking through all these books on Freemasonry, because this is before the internet, kids, right? Yeah. So we didn't have that many books, and I was like, geez, you know, like these are books I haven't seen before. So I'm sitting, you know, I had a lot more time in my hands before the internet. So I sat and I went through these books, and I thought, I had this stuff in it about these 4 virtues, like fortitude and temperance and stuff. And then there's stuff about Pythagoras and Plato getting mentioned in here, and seems to be a lot about kind of like King Solomon and Judaism and Christianity. And so, you know, Freemasonry is very common in the part of Scotland that I come from, because our national bard, Robert Burns, was a Master Mason. Everyone knows that. So most of my friends' fathers were Freemasons growing up, right? And, you know, my father had this kind of philosophy of life that was derived from Freemasonry, which is like an amalgam of Christian ethics and spirituality combined with Hellenistic, kind of weird mixture of Hellenistic influences. And then I somehow got from reading that into kind of looking, I read the Bible, and then I started to read Christian spiritual texts. I'll run through some stuff just 'cause it's relevant, right? So I read The Cloud of Unknowing. I read The Mystical Theology of Dionysius, Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite. I read Imitation of Christ. And then I started to really get into Gnostic Christianity and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I wasn't really that into Dead Sea Scrolls actually, but I really get into the Nag Hammadi Gnostic literature, like the Gospel of Thomas and stuff like that. And that stuff is full of references to Platonism. Actually, one of the Nag Hammadi Bibles, we in a parallel universe, Brian, there's the version of Christianity in which the Bible contains an excerpt from Plato's Republic. If you could wrap your head around that, because these early Christian scriptures that were discovered in Egypt in the 1940s, one of the books has these Gnostic Christian Gospels, has an excerpt from Plato's Republic in it, in their version, their Bible. How, like, this is an alternate parallel universe version of Christianity, right, where Socrates is included. So I was reading that, and it's heavily steeped in Neoplatonism because of the era in which those texts were written. So then I went and I read Plato and Plotinus, and then I went to university and I studied philosophy, and I studied Wittgenstein and Heidegger at university. I studied Aristotle and Plato, but you don't normally study the Stoics. And I was reading Freud and Jung. And I studied also history of Indian religions. So I studied the Bhagavad Gita, the Dhammapada, the Upanishads, obviously, and a lot of kind of Hindu yogic texts. Also, Tao Te Ching, Yi Jing, Sun Tzu, all that kind of stuff. I was reading lots and lots of kind of spiritual texts and things. And I practiced meditation. I was a secretary of the Buddhist Society. I used to go on Buddhist meditation retreats and stuff. And I felt like I was juggling lots of balls in the air. So I wanted to help people, be like a psychotherapist or a counsellor. And I wanted to understand life, the universe, and everything through doing philosophy. And I also wanted to be able to kind of help myself by doing some sort of self-hypnosis or self-help or meditation technique or yoga or something like that. And I was all over the place for about 6 years. And then after I graduated, I went back to study Plotinus. And I read a book by Pierre Hadot called The Simplicity of Vision, a very eminent French scholar. And I realized I liked it so much I'd read Hadot's other books, What is Ancient Philosophy? And Philosophy is a Way of Life, and The Inner Citadel, and so on. And Hadot's thing was to look at Hellenistic philosophy and identify the spiritual practices, the contemplative exercises in pagan philosophy, and to compare it to the early church fathers sometimes, and also to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuit order. And I thought it was really weird that Hadot, I guess he was too busy making those connections, had never made the really obvious connection between all of these contemplative practices he'd kind of catalogued and modern psychology, because I was also training as a therapist at the time. And I noticed that although we find this idea of philosophy as a way of life in all of the Hellenistic schools of philosophy, of which there are many, the Stoics were the school that placed the most emphasis on the therapeutic aspect of philosophy and on contemplative practices. And I started training in cognitive behavioural therapy, and I realised cognitive behavioural therapy was inspired by Epictetus and Stoicism. And so I at that point, got really immersed in Stoicism. That was roughly 25 years ago-ish. It was like a light came on, and I thought the Stoics have philosophy as a way of life. They have the therapy and they have the contemplative practices, like all in one thing. And I remember, like, at the time, kind of like laughing to myself and thinking, whoa, I was reading all these books all over the place. And I thought, now I just need to read Seneca now. Like, I just need to read one lot of books, because all of these different things seem to be combined for me in the Stoics. And I thought maybe I'll be into this for a while and then move on. But no, like, I've permanently got into it. I'm still into Stoicism. So that is the whole story.
No, that's actually really fascinating on the connections, because I've noticed the same thing with the contemplative practices, that and then maybe perhaps I'm going to I sent you the questions already. I talked about what would why is Stoicism so popular today. Maybe at the same time talk about in what ways, or is Stoicism or isn't Stoicism a competitor with other spiritual systems, or is it complementary? And maybe that's why it's so popular today.
Why it's popular today, so I work with, it sounds like an exaggeration, but I speak to thousands of people who are interested in Stoicism. Because of the conferences we run and the online courses, we've had maybe 20,000 people do the online courses that we run for the non-profit, by the way. So when we get feedback from them all that we go through. So over 25 years, I've spoken to thousands and thousands of people. And so the patterns I notice, I can just tell you what people say to me. So they say they see Stoicism as a kind of Western alternative to Buddhism. So they're into Buddhism, but they want something that's kind of more familiar to them and their cultural norms and values. And they go, oh, Stoicism's like Buddhism, but it's kind of more closer to home. It seems more familiar somehow. They want a secular alternative to Christianity, which is an interesting one. And they find that in Stoicism, even though Stoics believed in the gods, nevertheless, it was a philosophy rather than a religion. And it's an interesting question. What's the difference between a philosophy and a religion? But the people see it as a secular alternative to Christianity, in that it doesn't require faith, or it's not based on tradition or revelation. It is just based on philosophical reasoning. But other than that, it kind of leads to many similar ethical principles that compared to Christianity. They want something that's like academic philosophy that is more practical and down to earth. So I was like studying Heidegger and Wittgenstein, and I loved it, but it just didn't seem that practical in day-to-day life or helpful in the consulting room, whereas ancient philosophy is more down to earth and more pragmatic. And they want something that's like CBT, but is more of a philosophy of life. It's more profound, it's lifelong, and it's broader and deeper in scope. And so, Stoicism is like CBT writ large in a way. It's like, what do you do when you finish CBT? Well, if you want to turn it into a whole worldview, then Stoicism's probably the closest that you're going to find. Or sometimes I say to people, what would happen if you took the basic insights of CBT and built a philosophy of life around it? And people go, yeah, you'd probably end up with Stoicism or something pretty similar to Stoicism. So those are reasons people get into it. And then the other things I would say is historically, in the 1950s, Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy, which is the earliest form of cognitive behavioral therapy in New York, he was a psychodynamic, kind of Freudian, inspired, loosely psychodynamic therapist. And like a lot of people in the 50s, he was kind of getting disillusioned with that approach, and he abandoned it and decided he'd start again completely from scratch. He kind of cleared the table and went, I want to do therapy, but this stuff's not working. I need to start again from scratch. And he'd read the Stoics. He hadn't read Seneca, I don't think. He only ever talks about Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. But he started to quote Epictetus saying, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them, which is passage 5 of the Enchiridion. And that now is probably the single most famous quotation from Stoicism, because Ellis taught it, as far as I understand, to all of his students and all of his clients. And those went on to become the next generation of cognitive behavioral therapists. And so, certainly when I was starting out, every CBT practitioner knew that quote, and it was in every kind of introductory book on the subject. Maybe not quite as much now, but I would be disappointed if a cognitive therapist told me they didn't know that quote. They should know it, but I'm starting to wonder if they all do now. But certainly there was a time when they all knew it. It was a cliche. And so Stoicism became popular again. Ellis liked to say that he'd made Epictetus famous again. And that's not entirely true, but Stoicism did partly go through a renaissance because of the association with cognitive behavioral therapy. And then I guess the other thing is, looking at it from another angle, Stoicism is popular with a number of different groups of people. It's popular with the military, it's popular with sports coaches, it's popular with therapists and corporate trainers and life coaches. But it's also popular with millennials that work in the tech industry. That's a major demographic. So people talk about Silicon Valley Stoics and stuff. Tim Ferriss is really into Stoicism. Ryan Holiday's written loads of best-selling books on Stoicism. And it's a lot of young people that work with technology, curiously, into Stoicism. And so they all tend to say that they feel Stoicism gives them a rational philosophy of life that kind of fits in with their ethos, and it allows them to cope with the demands of modern society. And, for example, like they feel that they're bombarded with alarming news, propaganda. The news media and the internet are full of hatred and fear, and they feel overwhelmed by that. And they feel that they need a kind of a robust way of coping, and everyone wants emotional resilience. And so, Stoicism is popular, interestingly, because people trying to cope with living alongside modern technology and social media feel that Stoicism is helpful to them in maintaining their sanity amid this chaos. By the way, I like to say that this ancient philosophers in the Socratic tradition, as you may know, were traditionally contrasted with these kind of quasi-philosophers that preceded them, called the Sophists. And I used to think the Sophists are kind of interesting, but we don't really have them as much today. We have self-help gurus and stuff maybe, but nothing quite like the Sophists. And then one day I realized we do really actually, it's just they've mutated. Like Facebook is a sophist, and Twitter is a sophist. We have digital sophists, like that work in the same way. Well, Socrates, the beef that Socrates had with the sophists, and they were kind of frenemies. He had a sort of love-hate relationship with them. But his complaint about them was that they gave these elaborate speeches, and they were really trying hard to manipulate people with rhetoric and persuade them, to evoke fear and anger, and to persuade them by cunning use of language, sometimes to persuade them of things that weren't rational. And Socrates said that the sophists compete to win tournaments in public speaking, and they compete to win the biggest fees that they can when they were celebrities. And so that's really like the news media today, competing to be as sensationalist as they can to get the largest number of reactions or likes or comments from the online audience. It's fueled by gaining attention and doing whatever they are to increase what they call engagement. But that's the sophists were driven by the need for engagement. The sophists would say anything to get more applause, like whether or not it's actually true. Like we have the same problem today, and it's probably we kind of create ourselves, because we fuel this monster that just tells us whatever we want to hear, or tells us stuff that's going to shock us or press our buttons. We encourage it by giving it more and more of our attention. So that's the other reason that people are getting into it today, I think. And then obviously the pandemic has made people interested in Stoicism.
I actually I first heard about Seneca from Tim Ferriss's podcast. I've listened to that on and off over the years. And so that's how I was actually started reading Seneca for him. So I always have to thank Tim Ferriss for that. And that got me recognizing, I noticed this, you mentioned the Silicon Valley persons, and we've already connected this back to contemplative practices, but I'm a Methodist, and Methodists were known for being methodical. We have rules of life and everything. And I just noticed all these entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, they're fasting, they're meditating, they're doing TM, but they're still like doing a meditative kind of practice. They're reading scripture, which would be like Seneca or whatever. And I thought, wow, these guys are like the new Methodists in a sense that they've allowed them to create this alternative. So let me ask kind of a theological question a little bit for you. When we translate Stoicism into 21st century, I mean, you tease this out a little bit in one of your answers already, but depending on which one you're reading, you get the impression, like Seneca talks about fortune or fortuna, or however you say the Roman goddess's name of fortune or providence. Epictetus talks about gods or gods. Or you mentioned Marcus Aurelius, in a sense he's actually the Pontifex Maximus, so he's like the first pope in a way. So how do you translate that kind of religious piece that they have into the modern world? And again, this is just obviously, I'm just not directly asking you. It's a big question. Yeah, it's
a controversial question. So brace yourself. Like for some reason, and I think anyone who's interest in theology or religion will be aware that what's it people say, don't talk about politics or religion in polite company. It's in Stoicism we find the same thing. The only thing that people really argue about is the stuff about Stoic theology. Like it gets quite heated sometimes. So I'm just going to say what I believe.
Yeah, please.
And there might be people that don't like it very much or disagree. Like that's they're welcome to do so. First of all, Stoicism flourished as a philosophy for 5 centuries in Greece, Rome, and throughout many different regions within those parts of the world. And there are at least 70 or 80 Stoics of whom we know the name. And so did they all hold the same theological beliefs? No. They disagreed with one another about theology. And even in the surviving texts, it's clear that some of them sound more theistic than others. Some of them tend to say gods, some of them say God. Officially, as it were, or typically, Stoics were pantheists. And actually, we know that they weren't all, but most Stoics were conventionally pantheists. And they're kind of quasi-materialists. So they do not believe, and this is partly because they're disagreeing with Plato. So Plato had this idea of what Nietzsche later mocked as the world behind the scenes. Yeah. And Nietzsche said, there's no point in positing a world behind the scenes because we don't have any contact with these. So you can say what you like about it. It just, you're just hypothesizing or speculating when you're doing metaphysics. And the Stoics were like that as well. They said, no, we don't, there's no point speculating about this kind of metaphysical realm that we can't see. They said, we think it's better to think of God in terms of the totality of life, the universe, and everything. Like God is the logos, or the law, or logic, that animates the universe and structures it and makes it what it is. And when you try and reason as an individual and think clearly, we have this gift of self-awareness and consciousness and the ability to string sentences together. But we do it pretty badly, the Stoics thought. We are rational in the sense that we have a faculty of reason, but we're all pretty rubbish at using it, and we fall far short of the ideal of perfect wisdom. But the Stoics thought that ideal of perfect wisdom is God, it's Zeus, and we are kind of like a pale imitation of it. But we've got this duty to ourselves and to the universe to try and get closer towards this ideal of perfecting ourselves. So I want to throw in some things that Stoics said about theology. So first of all, they thought that the Greek myths were basically symbols or metaphors. So on the one hand, they could accept a wide range of conventional forms of religion and ceremony because they interpreted it all as symbolic or metaphorical. So in some ways, they were kind of conservative in religious terms, but on the other hand, sometimes people even thought they were atheists or agnostics because they didn't take some of these symbols and myths more literally. So I guess you get the same thing probably happening in Christianity and other religions, with some people taking more literalist angles and interpreting the text and so on. And other weird things that the Stoics say that I'd be interested to see what Christians think about. Like the Stoics originally said, look, because God is everywhere, he doesn't dwell in temples or inhabit statues and things like that. So the Stoics said, although they recognized the value of temples in society, they thought in a perfect world we wouldn't bother having them because we would all just be communing directly with God. And so every man would be a priest, was their kind of ideal. They had this utopian vision while recognizing that the world wasn't like that. So in practice, Stoics recognized conventional religious practices, but they thought, we don't even take the temples that seriously, though, because they like to say God is everywhere. He doesn't live in a temple, and once we decide that we're not taking this whole thing that literally, it kind of we have a slightly more ambiguous or ambivalent relationship to these practices. And another interesting one is the Stoics have a very interesting attitude to prayer. And I would love to know if there must be parallels in different forms of Christianity. So in Socrates, who's kind of the godfather or granddaddy of the Stoics, kind of sets the stage for this as well. He also has an interesting attitude towards prayer. So most people would traditionally pray for rain or a good harvest or fertility, like to have children and things like that, or to be healed of a disease. And the Stoics thought it's better to pray for God's help in attaining wisdom. And it's better to, rather than to pray for wealth, it would be better to pray for indifference towards wealth, right? Because their whole focus was on improving their character so that they were less dependent on these external things. And so they said, well, if we really believe that, then we wouldn't pray to God for these external gifts. We'd pray for God for the inner transformation of the spirit, like that we become more reliant on God, on ourselves, and less dependent on these external things. And they also pray by saying, may God give what he gives and take away what he takes away. So their other way of praying is just by a way of expressing acceptance of God's will. So they have a more philosophical attitude, a more radical, paradoxical way of praying compared to what would have been typical in the ancient world. And I think partly for this reason, see, Stoicism isn't a religion, but I would say, I mean, people will define the word religion differently, right? So we have to be clear about that. But I would say Stoicism is more like a philosophy of religion. It's more like a philosophical theology, and it could potentially be combined with different religions. So in ancient Greece and Rome, they combined it with Greek religious practices. They combined it then with Roman religious practices. People in the ancient world would combine it with different cults within those, those broad networks of pagan religion. And, there were Jews that assimilated aspects of Stoicism. There were subsequently Christians in the Renaissance that reintroduced Stoicism and called it Neo-Stoicism. Justus Lipsius in Belgium, and in England, the Earl of Shaftesbury, for example, were Renaissance Neo-Stoics. And also something that I should mention is that Christianity originated at a time when Stoicism was flourishing. And I'll phrase this carefully. There's some kind of connection between Christianity and Stoicism. The original Christianity, in particular St. Paul. One scholar describes St. Paul as a crypto-Stoic, which I think is kind of going too far, right? But there seem to be elements of Stoic terminology in the New Testament and Stoic-influenced concepts. And out of all the schools of ancient philosophy, arguably the Stoics are the ones that most obviously have ideas in common. The Stoics were monotheists. They were pantheists, like similar. They believed in the brotherhood of man. And so they had this kind of theological and ethical ideal that in many ways was similar to early Christianity. Now, some trivia I want to give you, right? The Stoics are actually in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. Not a lot of people know that. They're in the Acts of the Apostles.
Acts 17.
Because, St. Paul goes to the Areopagus, which is just down the road from where I am at the moment, and he speaks to Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, and he quotes a Stoic line of poetry to them from Aratus, who was a student of Zeno, founder of Stoicism. And he says a bunch of things. It's an odd passage because he seems to be kind of arguing with them. But also, a lot of the stuff that he's saying is definitely stuff that they would have agreed with anyway. And then also, many of the church fathers had originally trained in Stoicism and had a kind of, again, a sort of love-hate relationship with Stoicism. They'd be critical of it. But in the ancient world, often people would be critical of a philosophy, but also borrow big chunks of it. So Tertullian, the Gnostic Marcion, and St. Augustine all had studied and were influenced by Stoicism. And I'm sure other church fathers were as well. So there was this kind of, and another little bit of trivia. It's all trivia, I'm afraid, but it's interesting. Early Christians preserved Stoic ideas and texts. And for example, there were letters that are now known to be fake. Oh, Seneca's brother is also in the New Testament. His name is Gallo, and there were letters between. So Seneca was a contemporary of St. Paul, and there were letters that circulated between Seneca and St. Paul, which are now universally considered to be fake. But nevertheless, it shows that early Christians were into this idea. The Stoics and early Christians were kind of kindred spirits, like, and could be buddies, pen pals.
No, that's good. That's really helpful. And you just covered a lot of ground there. So I wanted to, and you mentioned Saint Augustine, and just to move
I've got another piece of trivia I want to mention.
Yeah, please.
For
Yeah,
any
please.
Catholics out there.
Yeah.
And Dante, just a random bit of Stoic trivia. In Dante's Divine Comedy, in Purgatory, the most enlightened soul in Purgatory, who guards the gates of Purgatory, is the Stoic Cato of Utica. And so Dante basically implies that Cato is as virtuous, as close to a Christian as you can get without believing in Jesus. Like, he has the most prestigious position in Purgatory. Like, so he's the Stoic is the pagan he admires the most.
No, that's interesting, and thank you for making those connections too, because it's kind of interesting to think that we're talking about Stoics and Paul's there, and it's actually really cool that you're in Greece right now doing this too. So, and you have that wonderful, interesting sermon that Paul preaches, trying to contextualize the message with all these philosophers present.
Can I just read you a part from that? I'm just looking at it because I don't know it by heart. I was reading it before we started. So St. Paul says at the Areopagus, the God who made the world and everything in it, the Stoics are nodding. They go, yep, Zeus. And he says, is the Lord of heaven and the earth? And they're like, yeah, Zeus. And does not live in temples built by human hands. And the Stoics are like, so far so good, buddy. That sounds like Stoicism. And he's not served by human hands if he needs anything. Rather, he himself gives everything, life and breath and everything else. The Stoics would just be nodding. I guarantee you the Stoics would have been nodding along to that, going, yep, told you so. You're not telling, you're preaching to the converted. So yeah, a lot of the stuff he says here, really, it's odd, because I kind of get the impression from that passage that he's kind of trying to convert them or disputing with them, but actually and then he goes on to quote, for in him we live and move and have our being, he says, quoting from a Greek poet, and they'd be like, yup. And then he says, as some of your own poets said, and he quotes Aratus, we are his offspring. So and they'd be like, yeah, we Zeus is the father of mankind. I think pretty much everything in that passage, the Stoics would be like, this sounds like Stoicism.
Yeah, and that's the Book of Acts is really interesting because Paul models he is actually trying to convert them, and it's one of my expertise. I mean, it's like my book's right. Well, it's right here. It's on how to read the Bible missionally, and basically Acts 17 is one of the critical texts there, because Paul essentially is modeling how to do evangelism, because for everything what you just said, he walks them all the way through, and they're all nodding their heads. And then the piece that drops, that ends the conversation, is then Paul makes a claim about the resurrection of Jesus, and that's ends up being this. Exactly, and that's the whole gospel.
The Stoics would be like, that's a nice metaphor.
Yeah.
So they probably lose them there, but they'd be like, yeah, that's a metaphor, like the resurrection of Osiris or something, or
Yeah, and all Paul was looking for, like that whole chapter ends, most people are scoffing, but others said, we will hear you again about this, and so they're going to go back and talk. So he was just basically, and we don't always know the whole story about that, other than there was the churches there. So that was Paul's method about being able to connect contextually, or with the persons that believe in the idea that again, I'm not trying to preach to you, but the idea that perhaps if there's a truth there, that God's already been there, and so Paul was just trying to track it out of these different cultures to try to point something, maybe the ultimate answer or whatever. But let me ask you this question, because it's clear, my own daughter when she was in high school, she was an international baccalaureate, and I had my kids reading Epictetus when they were teenagers. They're not that old now; they're just in their early 20s. But I had them read Epictetus. So she wrote a little paper on Epictetus and St. Paul, and I taught her how to do some word study. So she was teasing out some of the words, and what's his name? Rowe up at Duke University has a book on, he tries to argue that they're competing traditions or whatever. So there's clearly connections. But I'm interested in this. You mentioned St. Augustine, and you talk about with Stoicism, you have vice and virtue, and you talk about the what is it? The choice of the choice of Hercules. You have this wonderful poem, but at the end you have this this whole question that Stoicism is about getting rid of vices and pursuing virtue. And then you use some I think it's modern language, but that it reminded me of like St. Augustine. You talking about excessive desires or even harmful desires that lead you down the vice. Now, I don't know how familiar with Augustine, but he always talked about basically like modern theologians talk about Augustine in terms of disordered desires. And you didn't say disorder, you say excessive. So it's kind of a theological twist on it. So when you think about Stoicism, how does it promote virtue over against vice? And as a modern psychotherapist, how do you understand where that whole idea of a harmful desire that would lead you to a vice or an excessive desire would come from? Again, I know that's another huge question. I'm just curious how you would talk about that.
I mean, to cut straight to the chase, really, and cognitive, Freudian and Jungian and like psychodynamic therapy in general was very kind of preoccupied with the question, where does desire come from?
Yeah.
It's got something to do with our childhood, it's the unconscious, whatever. And modern psychotherapists, like that led to a very long-winded and complicated debate in philosophy and psychotherapy, like from, I don't know, like 1950s onwards, or maybe even earlier than that, where people basically, to cut it long, very long story, very short, people just felt this was very problematic from a theoretical, philosophical, psychological point of view, and also that it was problematic in practice. And we were talking earlier about modern psychotherapy. First of all, it's much more here and now focused. So we are much more focused on how is the desire actually affecting you and what could you do to change it, rather than like where did it come from or how did it originate or why do you have this desire. And the real question is this desire harming you or other people? Why, what are the consequences of this desire, and what are the things that trigger it, and what are the things that maintain it? Like, how does it actually work? Like, how does this engine actually function, rather than which factory was it built in? Like, that doesn't matter anymore. Like, and then also, in addition to that, we now know that a particular cognitive style, like a particular style of thinking, which we can call ruminative thinking, is toxic in many cases, and particularly in clinical depression and certain forms of anxiety, like generalized anxiety disorder. And so when people engage in ruminative thinking, they're typically asking a lot of why questions. Why do I feel this way? Why do I have these desires? And what clients in therapy often find is that they go round and round and round in circles for years asking themselves those questions and never get an answer. And then the time that they spend asking those questions and the state of mind that they're in when they're doing it, it often exacerbates the depressive symptoms. So they become more and more withdrawn and introspective. They become more and more preoccupied with the past, more and more preoccupied with their feelings and with subjective feelings of suffering in particular. And that's a toxic cocktail, a recipe for neurosis, whatever you want to call it. Like, so we try and snap people out of that now and get them to focus more on what the consequences of their desires are. Like, how is it actually affecting your marriage? Like, how's it affecting your performance at work? Like, and Stoicism and so the choice of Hercules is like that, really. I think if I remember rightly, it alludes to this paradox that Socrates was very interested in, who would say, look, Socrates liked to say, and this isn't the only reason for moderation, but he would say, look, even on your own terms, people who indulge in excessive desires, like they gorge themselves on fancy foods, for example, it's self-defeating because they spoil their appetites and they don't actually end up enjoying their food as much in the long run. And Socrates liked to say, the people that enjoy food the most are people who experience hunger. And, when you're really hungry, you'll enjoy even a crust of bread. So he said, he used to like to say the best relish, the best sauce is hunger. And he said that the paradox with you guys is that in your pursuit of pleasure, you're actually spoiling all pleasure. Like it doesn't even make sense in its own terms. But there are many other things, like the Stoics would say when we look around us, that Socrates also used to like to say, he used to frame the question like this. He would say, who would you trust most to run the state? Like somebody who indulges impulsively in all of their desires, or somebody who's able to exercise moderation and restraint in their appetite and control their body and their desires. Who would you trust most to coach or educate your children? Somebody who's impulsive and indulges their desires, or somebody who shows moderation and restraint and only indulges their desires insofar as it's actually good for them and like the welfare of people around them. And the Stoics would also say, like, who do you admire the most? People that indulge their desires to excess, or people that are self-possessed, like, and have enough self-awareness to exercise a healthy degree of moderation. So this is partly where the Stoic idea of virtue comes from. And, the Stoics are interested in the idea that we, it starts small. Like, one of the Stoic teachers, Musonius Rufus, said, you guys, when we're doing philosophy, you talk about Plato's ideal republic, but the way that you eat your breakfast, like, should be of more concern to you, like, because you do these things every day where you're, acting like animals, like, you're showing no self-awareness, no restraint. He goes, by learning to eat with moderation in a way that's healthy, like doing what's healthy for us and what's good for society requires self-discipline, restraint, and self-awareness. Like, you need to observe yourself. Otherwise you're just kind of like, you're like something that's kind of run amok. Nobody's kind of like holding the steering wheel. So the Stoics are like, if you just go with your instincts, you'll be led all over the place. You need, in order to exercise moderation, the two most famous maxims from the Delphic temple to Apollo are know thyself and nothing in excess. And I think they're closely connected, because in order to know what's excessive, you have to study yourself. You have to know yourself. Like, what's too much food for one person might be not enough food for an Olympic athlete, for example. What's too much sleep for a small child, or what's not enough sleep for a small child might be too much for a middle-aged man. Like, so we have to know ourselves, study our own nature in different circumstances in order to understand how to exercise moderation. Moderation is a form of wisdom, as Socrates would say. It requires self-awareness and knowledge and also self-observation. This idea is central to Stoicism of a kind of mindfulness that they call prosoche, which Hadot says is also the same word is used in some of the church fathers. He draws this analogy between early Christian writings in this specific regard. And one of the Stoic practices, the Stoics say you can't exercise self-discipline unless you're watching yourself more or less constantly. Like, you have to develop a kind of continual mindfulness, because otherwise, as soon as you stop paying attention to yourself, then you're probably just going to lapse into, not exhibiting moderation anymore. Like, you lose control. Like, you're not watching the road anymore. You're not holding the steering wheel anymore. Like, he says, so the fundamental thing is that you need to learn to become self-aware.
And I want to be mindful of our time. So I want to, and you've covered a lot of the things I wanted to talk about, but I do want to bring this back to Marcus Aurelius and then ask you just a couple of quick questions, and then we'll wrap up the conversation here.
And before we finish, actually, there's one thing that I want to get in as well, so maybe we can do both. I'm going to read you some passages from the hymn to Zeus from Cleanthes. Maybe we can do that last.
Okay.
So I'll leave you with a little bit of what the Stoics actually say about their conception of God, and that's a more theistic aspect of Stoicism. But let's come back to that after we've answered your questions about Marcus.
Okay, that's good. Well, again, in your book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, you come back multiple times. In every chapter, you have a story about Marcus Aurelius. You connect with his life, which, and again, the book's just fantastic. So people will take a look at it and read it. So you start with sort of biography, and the theme that runs through your whole book in terms of just practices. One of them is modeling. You're looking at people, and as a Christian, I laughed every time you asked the question, what would Marcus do? Because the church for a long time was doing, what would Jesus do? But the whole idea is you have models of ethical behavior, and then, as you just said, you have also this know yourself, this kind of either self-reflective reflection that a person can do, or like as Marcus Aurelius modeled, actually writing, journaling, which is meditations, presumably, whether he knew other people are going to read it or not. He's keeping a journal to remind himself of different things. So if people are listening today and they wanted to get started to implement some key insights, takeaways from these great Stoics into their lives, again, regardless of whether they're Christians or not, they're listening, what would be some simple ways that a person can begin to incorporate some of these practices into their own lives?
Well, just to kind of go back to what you said earlier for a second, when we say, what would Marcus do, or I'd be interested to know where this came from in Christianity, actually, because that's literally what Epictetus says to his students. He says, ask yourself what Zeno would do, ask yourself what Socrates would do. So this is literally a question that the Stoics taught their students to ask, and that's something that we can do today. Now, for a long time, I don't know, I've always been a techniques guy in therapy, so I've always kind of, for some reason, avoided prescribing reading to people, because I get given books all the time, and I know that reading loads of books isn't for everyone. That said, I think with Stoicism, because it is a big philosophy, and because the Stoics are often trying to teach us quite nuanced things and things that are paradoxical, they're contrary to what the majority of people take for granted. I think a certain amount of studying is kind of necessary in order to kind of really understand. Maybe not for everybody, but for most people, I think it helps to read the text. So that would be kind of equivalent to studying scripture in a way.
Yeah.
And the way that people would do it, I would recommend, is to read the Handbook of Epictetus, because that was specifically written as a short guide for students of Stoicism. It's only about 20 pages long. And it's lots of short passages, and you can take one each day. It's like a sentence or a paragraph each day, and just kind of what people do is try and paraphrase it, so that they can take the what they think is the essence of it and put it into more modern language or more personal language. I'll just kind of make notes on it. Two things I would suggest as kind of little journaling techniques are either, like I say, paraphrase it into terms that are more personal to you, or if you take an idea, weigh up what the pros and cons are of believing that idea and putting it into practice. I find that incredibly useful. I've used that a lot over the years with workshops and stuff, because if you force yourself to acknowledge in particular what the disadvantages are, then you can do something about them. You can correct them, or prevent them. So it allows you to do kind of troubleshooting, which is really essential. So so Epictetus says it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. If you get to the fifth sentence, so what would be the pros what are their advantages of focusing on that belief, and what possible disadvantages might there be? Well, one would be it's a bit of an oversimplification. It's not only our opinions, but can you take account of that? Could you provide a more nuanced version of this that would still get the same essential point across? Maybe in most situations, it's mainly our opinions that shape our emotions. That's what cognitive therapists would say today. So they would recognize, and Epictetus would recognize, that sentence is actually a simplification. He's trying to be concise. So there's that. Other common techniques that Stoics do are there's a lot of regular contemplative practices. One would be contemplating our own mortality. Seneca says that every day before he goes to bed, he tells himself he might not wake up the next morning. which is pretty intense. But I think these techniques can be very powerful if you feel that that's something that helps you to really seize the day and experience gratitude for life. Then that can be a very powerful technique, but maybe not for everybody. The other one is to the view from above, like to try and picture our lives as if we're looking at them within a much bigger temporal and spatial context. And the Stoics rightly understood that when people are upset, they narrow down the scope of their attention and they focus more on the individual things that are upsetting them. But when we broaden the scope of our attention, it tends to dilute the emotional impact of upsetting events. But it does it in a rational way. So it's not like we're avoiding things. We're viewing them more rationally by placing them within their actual context. And it's interesting that the Stoics thought, again, they said, well, what would the mind of Zeus be like, or the mind of God be like? And they thought, well, it would be omniscient, right? It would know everything. And so they say, well, the fact that I just got sacked from my job or I failed an exam or whatever, like God would know that, like, but it would be like just like one little pinprick in this like huge picture. And so he'd see all the ups and downs and, you know, put it within the bigger picture, the grand scheme of things, it would kind of lose significance. And so as individuals, the Stoics thought, well, we could never really achieve that perfect omniscience, but we can stretch towards it. We can reach more in that direction. And when we do, we think, yeah, like I failed an exam, but, you know, that's just one day in my life. Somebody called me an effing idiot on the internet. Well, that's just one person's opinion out of billions of people in the world. So when we broaden our perspective, we think, I can still accept that this thing happened, but it doesn't seem as all or nothing. It doesn't seem as overwhelming when I place it within a much bigger context. I got a bad review from somebody on Amazon or whatever. Like, if you go, well, I've got 999 other reviews. Right. So it kind of like, it dilutes it, is how I would say. It'd be like taking a drop of ink and putting it in a huge tub of water. Like, it's still there, but it dissipates. It doesn't evoke. It doesn't have the same power to evoke the same strength of emotion. And there are always ups and downs in life. It's a mixed bag, you know. So the Stoics thought the only rational worldview is the one that tries to take in the whole picture. Otherwise, we're committing a lie of omission by leaving out information in our appraisal of events. So those are some, like, there are, in the first book I wrote on Stoicism, I tried to list all the psychological techniques, and there were 18. So there's a lot. Like, those are, I don't know, we've talked maybe about three or so.
That's actually really helpful and gives people a place to start. And, you know, it's funny. I like that you call yourself a techniques person, because I get a lot of folks, and I have a lot of friends that do spiritual formation, and they like to tease me like, you always just want the techniques. I'm like, yeah, I do. Yeah. I just really want the techniques. So I appreciate you sharing some of those.
People always want the techniques.
Yeah, but they're helpful, right? I mean, it's just, it helps you to operation. Like I always say, I mean, from a Christian, like even the things you just talked about, these are tools that help us connect. If you have these big ideas, you got to ground them in some way. So these are tools that let you operationalize the things that you say you believe so that you can live out your values, whatever. I mean, again, I'm a Christian, so I have certain Christian values, but if I just say those things and I don't have them flowing out of my life, I mean, if Paul walks up on that hill and he's talking to these philosophers, yeah, he ends with Jesus and the resurrection, but if he's out living completely unvirtuous, they're not even going to listen to him for 1 second. But if he walks in there with his virtues and can have some philosophical arguments, perhaps somebody might be interested in who his God is. I mean, so I think it's just so important. So thank you for that. I want to ask you a couple quick questions. I think they're quicker questions, and then let's end with the piece that you want to share on there. Because again, this is, I mean, I could talk to you for, I think, a long time, Donald. So I really appreciate this. Is so interesting to me.
It's fun.
Yeah. So if you were going to pick, you've mentioned a lot of books, but if you're going to, and let's just kind of say, we'll just say Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, these primary sources, or we'll just assume that those exist. But what would be 2 or 3 books that you found really helpful for yourself, you know, personally or professionally, that you like to recommend to other people?
I'll just say, in terms of the classics, almost everybody that reads the Stoics begins by reading Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah.
And a lot of people make the mistake of reading out free of charge out of copyright 19th century translations. And then they go, I tried reading that, and it seemed really old-fashioned.
Yeah,
So for some people, that's cool, but for other people, it's kind of like hard. So George Long's 19th century translation is beautiful, and it's like very popular, but it's kind of hard to read for some people.
Yeah.
Gregory Hayes' translation of the Meditations is probably the most popular one, and then second to that, Robin Hard's, which is one I actually prefer, are two modern translations of the Meditations. And then the next thing that people should read is the Enchiridion or Handbook of Epictetus, because it was written as an introduction to Stoicism. It's only about 20 pages long. And so you can find that usually as an appendix to the Discourses of Epictetus, which you could read, but they're much longer. So I'd start with the short version. You start with the précis, the summary, the Enchiridion. And then read the moral letters of Seneca, and then you can go on and read Seneca's other works, and then you can read Cicero on the Stoics, and there's a whole bunch of other things that you might want to read. But also, if you're interested in Stoicism, I would recommend, and this is kind of somewhere in between, like, if people say what books should they read, I'm usually kind of reluctant to recommend books just because I think they're cool, with one exception. And that's Plato's Apology. Because Plato's Apology is like our Bible. It's a literary masterpiece. It's like almost like a gospel in the Western philosophical tradition. Like, the Stoics would have all known it almost by heart. Like, you know, every ancient philosopher knew, even critics, like the Epicureans who weren't that into Socrates, all knew Plato's Apology, because it was like it was the most highly lauded piece of philosophical writing in the Western canon, and it's not that long, and it's quite dramatic. It's the speech that Socrates gives in his trial. There's a little bit of action in it and stuff. It's not all just dialogue. I think everybody in lockdown or whatever, you know, everyone should read Plato's Apology. It's the most important. It'd be like reading the Christian Gospels or something. Like, you know, even if I was a Christian, I'd say read the Gospels, then read Plato's Apology. Like, I'd rank it up there as being like one of the most important things to read. And it's kind of very similar to Stoicism. It precedes and sets the stage for Stoicism. In terms of modern books, Haddo's writings are academic, but most people find them very accessible. So Pierre Hadot's The Inner Citadel is the best book on Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Everyone loves it, and so, you know, I would definitely say read that. And then there are like loads and loads of other like books on Stoicism that you could read. Ryan Holiday's The Daily Stoic is, I think, really good, and it's and Stephen Hanselman is a co-author. Contains many original translations of well-known Stoic passages and also some obscure Stoic passages. So it's a really good kind of source book for bits and pieces. And those are like, there's also good books by Massimo Pilucci's How to Be a Stoic. Ryan's new book, Lives of the Stoics, is more about the history of famous Stoics, but it's also really good. William B. Irvine's A Guide to the Good Life is also a really good book. It's really popular. I'd attach a caveat to that, which is that I don't agree with his interpretation of Stoicism. I think he makes it sound too much like Epicureanism. But other than that, I recommend that book. I think it's a really good introduction to the subject. And, you know, and apologies if I've forgotten books by any of my other numerous friends who have written books about Stoicism, because there are lots and lots of them out there now. But yeah, those are some of the main things I'd recommend. That'll keep you busy.
No, that's good. That's a good list. And I'll have all these listed in the show notes. Again, I'm going to let you do these quotations at the very end. But so before I do that, let's if folks want, obviously they can find your books on Amazon. How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. Where else can folks find out more about you if they're interested in engaging?
My website. I mean, I've got a lot of social media stuff, online courses and things. I do a lot of things online. But my website is just donaldrobertson.name. So instead of .com, it's .name. Okay. That's just my name, donaldrobertson.name. And they'll find me online there. And yeah, like things I'm actually writing a biography of Marcus Aurelius at the moment for Yale. I'm doing the graphic novel, as you mentioned, which will be coming out next year. And I just did the introduction for a collection of Seneca's letters as well.
Wow.
The Capstone Classics edition. I did the Capstone Classics edition of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations too, which that's already out, and the Seneca will come out soon. And I should mention also, I've got a secret project, like that I don't tell everybody about, but or I do tease it quite a lot, but without giving away details. But we're hoping to do something at the original location of Plato's Academy, which is just over half an hour's walk away from where I am at the moment, in Plato's Academy Park in Athens. And so if people are interested, they'll maybe be hearing about that perhaps in January or quite soon. Like, we're hoping that we might have an opportunity to do things in Athens to try and restore the Platonic Academy to some of its former glory.
Wow. This is a semi unfair question, but I'll just ask because it's fun to see what people say sometimes. Is there a book, because you've written a lot of books, obviously, and you've probably written maybe your dream book in some level already, or at least got at that. Is there a book that you're really afraid to write that's maybe inside of you somewhere?
I would just write it. I ask myself that question a lot, and I'm lucky that I kind of get to the books that I want to write. I want to write a book about anger, and I think that's really important for our society and also for therapy.
Yeah.
But I have a proposal for that. It'll happen at some point. I'm kind of tied up writing different books for 5 years from now.
Yeah.
I have different books that I'm committed to writing. So anger, and actually I just wrote an article on Medium about death that I really wanted to write, and I was kind of scared of writing because I thought it was a bit much. And I wrote it, and people enjoyed it. They were cool with it. So those are the things and the other thing I want to write, I think I'm going to do, if I can, in the biography of Marcus Aurelius I'm doing for Yale, there's a bunch of controversies about Stoicism, and I want to write about those. And but it's hard. So one of them is I actually want to write a little bit about the relationship between Stoicism and Christianity.
Yeah.
So that's quite a vexed subject. So people will say, Marcus Aurelius persecuted the Christians. I'm not really convinced that that's historically accurate. And I know people will go nuts at me and send me lots of links to the Catholic Encyclopedia and stuff like that. But I'd like to have that debate more fully. I've written about it quite extensively on my blog, but I'm hoping that I'll manage to fit that into my biography. It might be tricky. I might not be able to, but I'd really like to engage with that, because I think the historical relationship between Marcus Aurelius and Christianity is kind of complex, and there's also completely contradictory evidence from two of the church fathers that say that Marcus protected Christians. So I'd like to kind of unravel that a little bit more and put a case forward for a more balanced appraisal of Marcus's relationship with Christianity. And the other thing I'd like to do, I've always said that I think Stoicism is a philosophy of love. And in that respect, again, it kind of is a precursor of Christianity. And first time I said that, people thought I was genuinely thought I was joking. And I'm not. I'm completely serious. It actually is a philosophy of love. It's an attempt to kind of articulate a particular understanding of brotherly love and what that would look like. The whole of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, in a sense, is an attempt to figure out how to love mankind in a rational and philosophical way, and how to avoid love from becoming infatuation or becoming toxic or unhealthy. So I'd like to kind of really explore that dimension of Stoicism, and again, I'm hoping to do that in the biography that I'm writing. Although it's hard because it's a short biography, and Marcus Aurelius' life is complicated. So maybe that I'm going to have problems with the constraints of fitting that much stuff in. I might have to compromise and just kind of touch on some of those subjects very concisely, but then I don't want to upset people who think, well, you didn't really go into it in enough detail. But I'd rather do that than not go into it at all. And the other one is the attitude towards slavery. The Stoics condemned slavery. So people find that unbelievable, and they get really irate about it on Reddit and stuff. They go, that can't be true. It is true. It's there in black and white. The Stoics said they thought the institution of slavery was evil. And we have whole arguments from a Stoic influenced philosopher, Dio Chrysostom, who explains at length what the rationale for concluding that the institution of slavery is injustice and a form of theft would be. And Marcus appears to allude to that in the Meditations as well. And then people say, well, he didn't take any steps to remove the institution of slavery. And they say, well, he couldn't have. He would have been assassinated. He had to face a civil war as it was. But if you look at his legislative record, he consistently, almost consistently, made many small changes to Roman law in order to increase the rights of slaves to earn a freedom or manumission. And in terms of Roman foreign policy and military policy, he resettled captured enemies or recruited them into the army rather than auctioning them as slaves or killing them. So I think there's a complicated case to be made in these really controversial areas. So my fear is that by poking the bear and tackling these controversial subjects, if I've only got 2 pages to do it in, I'm not going to be able to rally all of the detailed evidence and arguments that would do it justice. But also, if I wrote an entire book about it, it would just bore everyone to death and nobody would read it. So I think maybe I need to just take the risk and put forward an abbreviated version of the argument for these various things. So Marcus's relationship with Christianity, the idea that Stoicism is a passionate philosophy and a philosophy of love, and his attitude towards slavery and warfare are things that I'd like to challenge people's preconceptions about.
No, that all sounds so important. Again, I could just keep talking to you about these things. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I want you to share the text that you wanted to share, and then we'll kind of wrap things up at that point. And I'll thank you after you do that then too.
Well, thank you very much. And gentle listeners, are you sitting comfortably? So I'll begin, but it's very short. Yeah. This is a longer thing. I'm just going to read the first couple of stanzas.
And what is this again? I forgot. It's the
it's Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoas' famous hymn to Zeus.
Okay.
So he says, most glorious of immortals, Zeus, the many-named, almighty evermore, nature's great sovereign, ruling by law, hail to thee, O thee, 'tis meet and right, that mortals everywhere should call. From thee was our begetting, ours alone, of all that live and move upon the earth, the lot to bear God's likeness. Thee will I ever chant, thy power praise. So I wanted to quote that because not only is it a hymn to Zeus, that seems to kind of be more theistic in tone, but also in that hymn, as in many ancient hymns, he actually says several times that we should sing hymns of praise to the Stoic God, which clashes with Plotinus's claim that the Stoics introduced God in name only and were basically atheists. And yet that's one Stoic. It may be that there were other Stoics who were less theistic. So I think Stoicism is a broad church in the sense, and it encompasses people that kind of lean in somewhat in different directions.
No, this was just a fascinating conversation for me, Donald. So I want to thank you for the books you've written. Again, if you haven't picked up a copy of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, it's one of my favorite books of 2020. And I'm not just saying that because I have the author on my show. I really liked it. It's one of my favorite books that Donald listed all of these modern Stoic books. This is one of the, not only was it incredibly well written, but really, really profound. So I want to thank you for your work. Thank you for the generosity of your time, and we look forward to these other projects. So thanks for being on my show today, Donald.
Well, thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for the ride. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope in the world. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. It's a real privilege to have you as a listener. And if you found this episode to be helpful, would you consider sharing it with a friend and also leaving a review that would help other people to find it? If you're interested in the materials that my guest talked about, I do have links that take you to Amazon. They're affiliate links. They help if you purchase things. It doesn't affect your price, but it does help to support the podcast. And also, if you're interested in group coaching specifically designed for the needs and growth of pastors and spiritual leaders, I'd invite you to take a look at www.deepdivespirituality.com. If I can serve you in any way, reach out to me. You can send an email at deepdivespirituality@gmail.com. Again, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.